To understand how Malaysian family law works, we first have to understand the concept of a legal time capsule. Section 3 of the Civil Law Act 1956 governs the reception of English law in Malaysia. It mandates that Malaysian courts apply the common law of England and rules of equity as administered in England on a very specific cutoff date, the 7th of April 1956. This creates what we call a frozen application of English law. This means that if the UK reforms their laws after 1956, those changes do not automatically apply in Malaysia unless the Malaysian Parliament enacts similar specific legislation. Today, we are looking at a high-profile case that tested this rule. Khoo Kay Peng v. Pauline Chai Siew Phin. Let's look at the detailed facts. The plaintiff, the husband, and the defendant, the wife, were married in Malaysia on December 5, 1970. Over the years, they had 5 adult children. The husband, a prominent businessman, remained resident in Malaysia to manage his business. Meanwhile, the wife and children lived successively abroad, first in Australia from 1982, then Canada from 1989, and finally, England. In the year 2000, the husband's company actually purchased a property known as Rossway Park Estate in England, which the family used as a residence during their visits. The conflict began to escalate years later, following the husband's stroke in 2008 and a trip to England in October 2012. The wife decided to remain in England while the husband returned to Malaysia. This led to a race to court. On February 14, 2013, the wife filed a petition for divorce in the English High Court. In response, just days later on February 27, the husband filed an originating summons in the Malaysian High Court. The husband applied for an exemption from referring their matrimonial difficulty to a conciliatory body. But to proceed with the divorce in Malaysia, he first had to prove the Malaysian court actually had jurisdiction. The husband argued that because he was domiciled in Malaysia, his wife was too. He relied on the traditional legal principle that a wife's domicile is strictly dependent on her husband's. The wife contested this. She argued she had abandoned her Malaysian domicile and acquired a domicile of choice in England. Here lies the central legal issue. Was the Malaysian High Court bound to apply the pre-1956 English common law rule of dependent domicile, which dictates that a wife takes her husband's domicile upon marriage? Or could the court adopt the modern English position allowing independent domicile? Specifically, the court had to determine if the abolition of dependent domicile in the UK by the Domicile in Matrimonial Proceedings Act 1973 could be applied in Malaysia via Section 3 of the Civil Law Act 1956, or perhaps through Section 47 of the Law Reform Act. The High Court ruled in favor of the husband. It held that the common law rule of dependent domicile still applies in Malaysia. Justice Yeo Wee Siam provided a multi-layered reasoning for this decision. First, the strict interpretation of Section 3. The judge held that Section 3(1)(a) imports English common law only as it existed on the 7th of April 1956. The UK abolished dependent domicile later, in 1973, through a written statute, the DMPA. Since Malaysia has no equivalent written law, the court cannot import the UK's 1973 statute. Second, the wife tried to argue Section 47 of the LRA allowed Malaysian courts to follow principles conformable to the English High Court. The judge rejected this interpretation. She ruled that Section 47 does not empower the court to apply English statutes passed after 1956. The court can only follow English principles that are consistent with Malaysian law. This decision wasn't made without acknowledging the archaic nature of the law. The judge cited Lord Denning, who famously described the dependent domicile rule as the last barbarous relic of a wife's servitude. However, Justice Yeo explicitly stated, "Yet sitting in this court we must still observe it." She reasoned that while the law may be patriarchal, it is for Parliament, not the judiciary, to amend it. The court even addressed the constitutional argument that this rule violates Article 8 of the Federal Constitution regarding gender equality. The judge ruled that until Parliament amends the Law Reform Act or the Civil Law Act, the common law rule remains valid. Furthermore, the principle of stare decisis played a huge role. The High Court held it was bound by the Court of Appeal's decision in Nadunchelion v. Kohila. That Superior Court had unequivocally stated that a Malaysian woman acquires her husband's domicile upon marriage. Consequently, the judge explicitly refused to follow a conflicting High Court decision in Teo Ka Fook, criticizing it as a departure from settled law. She affirmed that a High Court judge is not bound by another High Court judge, especially when that decision contradicts the Court of Appeal. In conclusion, despite the wife being a Canadian, Australian citizen and residing in England, the court held she remained domiciled in Malaysia due to the dependent domicile rule. Because both parties were domiciled in Malaysia, the court held it had jurisdiction to hear the divorce petition. The husband was granted an exemption from referring the matrimonial difficulty to a conciliatory body under Section 106(1)(v) of the Law Reform Act. The court found that the irretrievable breakdown of the marriage, evidenced by the concurrent proceedings in the UK, made such a reference impracticable. Finally, the husband was awarded costs of $15,000. This case serves as a powerful reminder: in Malaysia, English law is frozen in 1956, and until Parliament acts, even barbarous relics remain the law of the land.
Imagine you sell millions of dollars worth of goods to someone overseas. The goods are high-value industrial materials, produced after months of manufacturing. They are shipped in bulk, carefully packed, and intended for resale or further processing. You ship the cargo across borders and oceans. You keep the documents until they pay. They never pay the final payment. Nevertheless, the goods are released and end up in their possession. However, that is not just bad business, that is a legal disaster. Today, we're looking at PT Karya Sumiden Indonesia versus Oceanmasters Marine Services.
It is a case that shows why in shipping law, paper controls property.
The seller was PT Karya Sumiden Indonesia, also known as KSI. They manufactured and sold copper rods. PT Karya Sumiden Indonesia is a manufacturing company that produces and sells copper wire rods and drawn copper wire. It is a group company of the Japanese multinational manufacturer, Sumitomo Electric Industries, Limited. The carrier responsible for transporting the cargo was Oceanmasters Marine Services, a shipping company based in Malaysia.
Besides, Oceanmasters operated through an agent called Sapphire Line.
The buyer was Jawad and Malik Metal LLC, known as JMM.
Based in Saudi Arabia, JMM is a company engaged in the trading of metals, including copper and related products. In this transaction, JMM purchased copper rods from PT Karya Sumiden Indonesia, KSI. So we already had a fully international setup, involving Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and Malaysia. Different countries, one shipment, and multiple parties. And yet, one small mistake in handling the cargo ended up costing more than $5 million, showing just how high the stakes are in international trade.
This transaction used a method called documents against payment. It means that the seller ships the goods but the buyer does not receive the key documents, especially the bill of lading, until payment is made. And the bill of lading is not just a piece of paper, it is the proof of the shipping contract and the document of title. Whoever holds the original can legally claim the goods. If there is no payment, the buyer does not receive the documents and therefore cannot take possession of the goods. It's a commercial seatbelt. It protects the seller from shipping goods and never getting paid. KSI shipped 3 consignments of copper rods from Indonesia to Saudi Arabia. Due to JMM never paid, so the original bills of lading stayed with KSI's bank. Everything was still legally locked. But then something unusual and unlawful happened when JMM arranged for a new set of shipping documents called switch bills of lading. A switch bill is basically a replacement bill of lading. It can change details like who the shipper is, who the consignee is, where the goods appear to be going. Sometimes switch bills are used legitimately for confidentiality or commercial convenience. But here's the problem: the original bills were never surrendered because JMM never paid. So suddenly, there were two sets of documents claiming control over the same cargo. By using the switch bills, the carrier released the goods at the port in Dammam, Saudi Arabia. The copper rods were delivered to JMM's customer. This caused KSI to lose goods worth over $5.9 million United States dollars. There was no payment and no original documents, yet the cargo was gone. Therefore, KSI sued Oceanmasters and its agent in the Malaysian High Court. The court had to decide several key legal questions. Number 1. Did KSI have the right to sue? The defendants argued that because JMM was the named consignee, KSI had no standing. The court rejected that, since this was a documents against payment sale, ownership was only supposed to pass after payment. JMM never paid. So legally, the goods still belonged to KSI. Number 2. Was the claim time barred under the Hague Rules? The Hague Rules limit claims against carriers to 1 year, but the court said that wrongful delivery, or misdelivery, falls outside the Hague Rules. Those rules govern the period of carriage, not what happens when goods are wrongly handed over at delivery. Number 3. Was there a breach of duty? Shipping law is strict on one point. A carrier must only deliver goods upon production of the original bill of lading. In simple terms, the carrier gave away property to someone who had no legal right to it. Number 4. Was there conspiracy? KSI argued that the parties had worked together to injure them. The court said there was not enough evidence of intention or collusion, so conspiracy was not proven. The court ruled in favor of KSI. Oceanmasters and Sapphire Line were held jointly liable for the loss. They were ordered to pay $5,914,010 United States dollars and 40 cents, plus interest and costs. In other words, the carrier had to pay for releasing the cargo without the proper documents. This case sends a clear message to the shipping world. Without the original bill of lading, the goods could not be delivered. Documents against payment only works if carriers respect the document system. Switch bills of lading, when misused, don't create rights but they destroy them. Shipping may look like paperwork, just forms, stamps, and signatures. But in law, paper is power. These documents decide who owns the goods, who has the right to receive them, and who bears the risk when something goes wrong. When those rules are ignored, it's not just a technical mistake. It's a decision that affects real companies, real people, and real money. And in international trade, one careless moment can turn into a loss worth millions of dollars. More importantly, this case highlights the significance of Malaysian Civil Law Act 1956. Malaysian shipping and maritime laws relies heavily on English common laws, as stated on Section 5 of the Civil Law Act 1956. This section applies English law concepts in this case such as documents against payment and bill of lading.